Welcome everyone. Everyone, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us in this room. Actually, this is a musical event, so maybe let's put something on. It might be better with the music. Yeah, I think that sounds a bit better, doesn't it? Well, I wanted to welcome you again, so welcome everyone. Everyone, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us in this room for Lincoln Leeds Season 3, Episode 3, on a topic some of you know is very dear to me. A fair amount of stress, I must confess, manifests itself when you rhyme an introduction. It's true, it is. It's like a game of chess with your heart poking through your chest. You might more or less miss your address, or at least mess it up. But I still wanted to do it, so before we begin, let me kick off this night and give thanks to those who I currently have in sight. My first shout out goes to Xanita Saayman. My second one goes out to JJ, aka the Alumni Office. I must say, your help was truly key in setting up Lincoln Leeds. It was not that easy. The third one goes out to our own team that I want to name right now. Brendan, Simone, Angeliki, and Kaspar. Andre and Nuno, our own team of hellcars. It's kind of hard to rhyme Kaspar, you know. But I hope you appreciated the effort. And finally, the college. The college, yes, the college, well, for the college, I must say, nothing but praise for their help in many ways, allowing us to stage these events in such a place with its oak paneling and its gorgeous ceiling. Clearly the best fit for a night this eclectic. I mean, for a panel this eccentric. Tonight we have a conductor, a fellow, and an EDM lover, debating theories about musical studies. It seems to me they'll discuss and disagree harmonic complexities, lyrical complexities as well, and intricacies. I think that's it for me. Thank you very much. I'll just go back from the start. No, I wanted to say, Mirza, and I'll give you the floor, and about these panelists, maybe you could tell us a little more.
So just wanted to welcome you all to the third Lincoln Leeds seminar of the 2019 series. I'm really excited to introduce today's speakers, who I think will make for a really brilliant discussion because their areas of interest span several centuries and lots of different genres. So the first speaker will be the Lincoln Fellow, Dr Fabio Morabito, who is the Lord Crewe Junior Research Fellow in Music at Lincoln. He read music at the University of Pavia in Italy and at the Hochschule für Musik Franz Liszt Weimar in Germany. After completing his PhD at King's College London, he spent a year as teaching fellow at Durham, and his research focuses primarily on musical culture in Paris and Vienna in the early 19th century, particularly looking at the cult of eccentricity, the origins of celebrity, the commercialization of selfhood, and the intellectual history of musical authorship. The Lincoln alumnus today is Paul Wingfield, who is currently head of vocal and operatic studies at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, who we're really grateful to have today because we were worried it would snow and we wouldn't have him, but luckily it's held off. He read music here at Lincoln, trained as a conductor and a repetiteur at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and the National Opera Studio. He's also worked as a conductor and assistant conductor at the Royal Opera House, where he was Jet Parker Young Artist from 2012 to 2014, as well as the Birmingham Opera Company, the Royal Ballet, the Welsh National Opera, and Opera Holland Park. He's also worked as a repetiteur for English National Opera, and in 2003 founded the Orchestra of the Royal Borough. So I don't think there's much more you could add to a CV like that. And our student speaker today is Ed Spencer, He's a DPhil candidate in musicology at Lincoln, and his doctoral research focuses on EDM, which I'm reliably informed stands for electronic dance music, since 2010, specifically the bass music genres of dubstep and trap. The project investigates the role of the drop in bass music through digital ethnography and fieldwork in the Midwestern United States, the use of bass music as a tool for trolling in YouTube videos featuring Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and the contagious choreography of the 2013 Harlem Shake meme. Edward has presented at a number of conferences in the States and in Europe, as well as organising a conference right here in Oxford entitled Music and the Internet in December 2018. And his study of YouTube comments on EDM uploads has been published in the journal Organised Sound. So promises to be a really exciting talk this evening. Thank you so much all for coming. And without further ado, I'll invite the first speaker.
Why does musical taste evolve? Is a question which most of us feel to have stakes in, even direct experiences, whether by performing, listening to, or doing research on music. As a result, scholars have dealt with this question through the most diverse range of approaches.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be back at Lincoln, and the Oakshott Room has changed enormously since I was doing choir rehearsals in here, however many years ago it was. What an interesting question. Why does musical taste evolve? And in exploring this question, I found myself asking a series of related questions, some of which Fabio has already touched upon. What determines taste? Fashion, market economies, stage of life, access, education? How, not only why, but how does it evolve? What changes first? The form or taste itself? I think Fabio may have answered that for us. Whose taste are we talking about? The individual's taste or collective taste? So, as a non-academic amongst you, I've decided to adopt 2 points of focus today, myself and my own musical upbringing, and the world in which I work, opera. So, to begin with myself, where have my musical tastes come from? How and why have they evolved? Well, I was born into an aspirational working class family. I'm half Malaysian on my mother's side. My mother's musical taste could be described as eclectic, broad-ranging, perhaps eccentric, disjointed. She came over here in the 1970s to join the NHS as a nurse and didn't have a huge amount of access to music in rural Malaysia before that point. And one question which I would love to ask everyone and the panel is how did her latecomer status to music, how did that affect how her own musical taste developed? My father was very keen to impress upon me his love of progressive rock music. Pink Floyd, the Electric Light Orchestra, Greenslade. And he was very proud of the fact that those bands represented for him a complexity, a subtlety, a nuance, a response to political, the political atmosphere, a response to art, which was so much lacking in the usual fare that you get on a weekly Top of the Pops. He felt that it somehow made him into a thinker. Which I was fascinated by. I wasn't allowed to use the LP player when he was at work, but what I was able to do was browse through his record collection, and I was fascinated by the object of these records, and by the artwork on these records. The complexity of this artwork, the tantalizing, unusual, coded, sometimes sexualized worlds displayed on these LP sleeves. It hinted to me as a 6, 7, 8-year-old boy of a world which was coded, which was secretive, which was somehow barred to me but which I really wanted to be involved with. How about myself? Well, I came to music very early on, and I displayed a desire from a very young age to move to music, to rock to music, to headbang to music. I wonder whether that was the start of me becoming a conductor, who knows. But anyway, piano lessons started very early on. I was 8 years old, and they were completely self-motivated. Now, one key pivotal moment for me, in terms of my own musical taste, was the moment that my father brought home from W.H. Smith a 10 cassette collection of the greatest classical composers, ranging from Vivaldi, Handel, right the way through to Tchaikovsky and Wagner. And it felt to me very strongly, and I still remember this feeling now, that contained within this set was the key to my musical and adult personality. That if I could only absorb the information contained on these cassettes, that I would somehow unlock the key to my future, that there would be nothing else for me to know, that in fact it would only then be a case of fleshing out my knowledge. In some degree I was correct, I think. The greatest works by the greatest classical composers. I can remember the box set to this day, and it was a springboard for 10, 15 years of record collecting cassettes, collecting CDs. And I brought some with me here today. Huge, wonderful box sets, all with their own emotional significance to me. I very much hoped to bring along the Georg Scholti recording of the Wagner Ring Cycle. Beautiful in deep blue, hinting at luxury inside, like a Russian doll. You open it up, 4 separate box sets in there, Walküre, Götterdämmerung, Siegfried, Rheingold, all there. A universe of opera contained within, bottle green CD sleeves, a gold libretto with all of that wonderful Stabreim that Wagner was so famous for. So much for you to digest. Sadly, I couldn't find it because it's up in my loft somewhere. But I did manage to find the complete set of Mozart symphonies, Geoffrey Tate, the complete Mozart piano concertos, Murray Pereira. And here, another important acquisition to this wonderful collection of mine, Parsifal and James Levine's recording of it. Most importantly, again, the object itself, the red banner, the maroon banner across the top, the Philips logo, and the Richard Wagner edition, plastered across the top there in gold, italic writing. And for me, that the labelling of that implies that you need to own more, that there is more to be had, and indeed, more I did have. I collected the whole edition. So the object itself is interesting to me. And one other question that I would like to ask everyone is, how have things changed now that we don't collect the physical object anymore, now that we don't have the physical library anymore? How is it different that now we have Spotify and we're able to compare 17 different versions of Der Zwerg by Schubert? How does that change things for us? It has the potential to mean that tastes evolve at a much quicker rate. But my knee-jerk reaction suggests that the opposite is true. What else to say about myself? Well, of course, education played a large part in honing my musical tastes. Access as well. I had access to the Royal Opera House to see my first Tristan und Isolde, to Glyndebourne. There was someone who was able to take me. So money clearly plays a part in all of this. Stage of life is something I'm also very interested in. 2013 Cambridge article about how stage of life is intimately connected to our musical tastes. And it seems to me as though I reflect that study perfectly. As a boy, very much interested in fast driving rhythms, anything that was perpetual motion, Baroque music, classical music, but also my father's top 50 hits. Anything which was fast was wonderful. As a teenager, I wanted anything which was epic and large. And that also included things that I read, War and Peace, Don Quixote, but the Ring Cycle, operas by Richard Strauss, Mahler symphonies, Beethoven symphonies. As a 25-year-old, now 35-year-old, things became far more intimate. I'm now very much moved by song text, by chamber works, by piano sonatas. So what's happening there? Stage of life. I'd like now to look briefly as well at the world in which I work, opera. And so much has already been touched upon by Fabio so brilliantly. And clearly, opera as a form and taste in opera has changed over the centuries, and it's very easy to pick out certain touchstone moments. Gluck's reforms, the revolutionary background to Le Nozze di Figaro, the bear pit of the 18th century theatre compared with the pre-cinematic, sexualized darkness of Bayreuth. It's easy to find those examples, but I'm rather interested in opera now as it exists in the 21st century, and ways in which tastes are changing, ways in which indeed they are not. And as a little sort of study to this, I had a look briefly at what was on at our national opera houses in this current season. The Royal Opera House is doing La Traviata, Così fan tutte, Caciocavallo. Opera North is mounting productions of Magic Flute, Aida, Caciocavallo. Welsh National Opera are doing Magic Flute and Un ballo in maschera. Scottish are doing Caciocavallo and Magic Flute. Glyndebourne is doing Magic Flute. What an interesting thing. Shared red, and clearly an industry which is risk-averse. One which is where everyone is leading everyone else. Because what do we need in opera? We need bums on seats. And just as one might choose, if you were going to go for afternoon tea in London, you would choose to go to the Ritz. So if you wanted to go to the Royal Opera House, you would choose to see Bohème. Far more, I think, than you would go to choose and see Written on Skin, say, for example, if you're going to spend £50, £100. It's not to say that the industry isn't trying its hardest to renew itself. So what are the barriers to change? Well, clearly, cost. It is prohibitively expensive to put on any opera, and it is even more expensive to put on a new opera, particularly to commission one, and quite often they require much longer rehearsal times as well. And there is no guarantee that opera houses are going to recoup their costs. So that's one thing. And as I've already mentioned, audiences as well are far less likely to want to risk their money on seeing something new. It is also my experience that in new opera, and I've worked on several over the past 5 years, there is now an over-intellectualization of new opera, an alienization of audiences. It is my strong belief that we go to the opera to be told stories, not narrative stories necessarily. The narrative can be broken, I'm quite happy with that idea. But so often it seems that composers are deliberately trying to subvert efficient, engaging text setting. We go to the opera, we go to the Wigmore Hall to experience difficult emotions by proxy. And so often it seems now that we are unable to do so. Going back to those seasons that I mentioned, Magic Flute, and interestingly, there are only 3 composers represented there, Mozart, Verdi, and Janacek. Janacek is an interesting one, isn't it? Caciocavallo is not a potboiler. It's not an opera that's done very often. An opera about a very unhappy woman stuck in a very unhappy marriage with a poisonous mother-in-law who has an affair, takes her fate into her own hand, and commits suicide at the end of the opera. It's not very well known. I just wonder whether there's something about the shifting sands of our gender politics, the hashtag #MeToo culture, perhaps, which has sparked 3 separate productions of that opera. But certainly Mozart, Verdi are key sellers. So, to wrap up really, and so much to say in 15 minutes, and I've only been able to touch on a few things, it seems to me that the common factor in all that I'm talking about here is market. I was seduced by the market as an individual. These objects are quite literally building blocks I thought, I feel, perhaps I was right, of my own personality, of my own status, perhaps. Complete works. I wanted to own and conquer complete works. And as a collective as well, in terms of opera audiences, the market clearly has a huge sway over musical tastes. It just so happens that the opera industry is moving at a snail's pace, as it is engaged in an act of self-preservation. And I use that word really very carefully indeed, self-preservation in the normal sense, but also self-preservation in the sense of self-entombing. It is becoming a museum culture, one in which we are afraid to escape from the tastes of an ageing and conservative audience. And I would suggest now the work to be done is to nurture the tastes of a new generation. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here, and I think this question that we're mulling over tonight is a really interesting one. As you've heard, my doctoral research focuses on dubstep, a genre of electronic dance music, and I'm particularly interested in the entanglements between dubstep and the social web. So to set the scene for those of you unfamiliar with dubstep and its online reputation, I want to begin with an urbandictionary.com definition. Dubstep, a genre that is filthier than fingering your sister and finding your dad's wedding ring. So the filthy demeanour of dubstep is significantly responsible for its mass appeal. During my 2017 fieldwork in Chicago and rural Ohio, I encountered sentiments such as these. Ooh, that's disgusting, give me more. The words of Stacy, a 25-year-old dubstep addict from New Jersey. I like filthy fucking nasty shit. The words of Callum, an 18-year-old dubstep fan from Illinois. But interestingly, dubstep hasn't always been defined by an appetite for the disgusting. Let's rewind to Croydon, South London, in the early 2000s. In the early days of UK dubstep, before it crossed the pond, as it were, the genre was considered to prioritise spiritual experience rather than sordidness. In its nascent form, dubstep was all about sub-bass, that is frequencies right down at the bottom end of the spectrum, between about 20 and 60 hertz. This sub-bass was sinusoidal and sounded smooth and pure and sublime. It dipped down beneath the threshold of human hearing and was experienced in terms of bottomless depth. The sheer weight of these sub-bass frequencies was perceived in terms of gravitas and profundity. And there's a seminal dubstep club night called DMZ, which emphasised these rather metaphysical aspects of sub-bass with its promotional slogan, "Come meditate on bass weight." And the kind of music being played at DMZ sounded something like this. Listen out for the deep sub-bass. But this otherworldly, deep dubstep was about to be degraded. Critically, the aesthetic status of bass evolved over the course of the decade. Initially, bass was perceived as something deep, but by around 2007, however, bass had become reified as something low. Deep meditative sub-bass was rubbished by the rise of aggressive mid-range riffs, and I want to quickly demonstrate the distinction between this kind of meditative sub-bass and this thrusting, filthy, sexual wobble bass. So I'm going to start out with quite a pure, bassy sound. But then if I change the cut-off threshold of the filter on this bass, something rather disgusting happens. And when this is modulated automatically by a low-frequency oscillator, we get what came to be called wobble bass.
I just have a few examples here of this kind of thrusting, grotesque wobble bass. I think we'll leave it at that. So that gives you some idea. Oh my God! Oh my word! Explosion of wobble bass around the turn of 2010. But why did an appetite for debased dubstep develop? So first of all, let's consider an argument presented by the EDM writer Saayman Reynolds. Reynolds stresses the importance of the synthesizer plugin Massive, which was released by Native Instruments in 2007. He writes, "Massive enables you to slather different synth textures together to make the sickest, slimiest bass line. The Massive sound was what finally pushed dubstep over the top in North America." Yet, as I've just demonstrated on some other software, debased bass can be created using plugins other than Massive. And while the release of Massive in 2007 was undoubtedly a significant factor, it's unwise to cast the software as a non-human actor with an agency and a sound of its own. Massive did not single-handedly determine the new appetites for filth in the USA. Theories of non-human agency are currently tremendously fashionable in the humanities generally, and musicology in particular, but it is actually the way that technologies are used by human subjects that is of significance. And so whilst there's certainly something in Reynolds' reference to the Massive plugin, his analysis risks the charge of technological determinism. Secondly, let us consider the reflections of Mala, a prominent early dubstep producer and the co-founder of DMZ. He places a great deal of emphasis on the 2007 UK smoking ban. I think the smoking ban had an impact on the sound. For a crew with hard smokers, what happens with a smoking ban is that you have an audience that aren't focused for the whole session. You're getting people coming in and going out, and that was disruptive to the dances, because it had the effect of shortening people's attention spans. High-impact tunes get the quick response. Again, there is something in this, but it seems pretty dodgy. This is because it privileges the live club setting as the primary or even the only arena in which dubstep was consumed. But we must acknowledge that EDM came to be voraciously consumed online during the mid-2000s. We might even say, as I have done in the paper, that the internet became the primary site for EDM consumption rather than club venues. The growth of the site dubstepforum.com is of great importance in terms of changing tastes, much more so than the more contained and coincidental issue of UK smoking regulations and changing drug habits. Many of the people engaging with the genre were doing so in the rather sober setting of their own bedrooms rather than at established club nights. So all in all, we might say that Mala's reflection on the smoking ban is an example of situational short-sightedness. And thirdly, notwithstanding my emphasis on the importance of the internet, we might do well to highlight dubstep's institutional mediation during 2006 to 2007. In the early hours of the 10th of January 2006, the BBC Radio 1 DJ Marianne Hobbs captured, quote, the flashpoint of an exploding scene, with a special broadcast called Dubstep Wars. Dubstep Wars is widely regarded as a watershed moment, inaugurating, as it were, a worldwide appetite for debased bass and laying the groundwork for dubstep's conquest of North America. The programme juxtaposed dubstep godfathers with next-generation producers, a format that gave the newer machismo sound a great deal of exposure. DJ Distance, over in that top right-hand picture, played out his heavy metal-inflected dubstep mix towards the end of the programme. The aggressiveness of this musical assault made it stand out from the other sets played by the more established Godfathers. A year later, in 2007, the wobble-based sound was promoted by another influential dance music institution, Fabric, London's infamous superclub. The Fabric Live 37 CD compilation was originally going to be mixed by the French electro duo Justice, but the record they turned in was judged to be mediocre. So right at the last minute, Fabric decided to commission a dubstep mix. They hurriedly contacted Casper and Roscoe, over here, bottom right, two dubstep producers who stood out from the crowd due to their mastery of filth. The resulting record not only reified debased bass as the sound of dubstep, it cast it as the hottest new sound in dance music as a whole. But despite the importance of the internet and despite the significance of dubstep's institutional mediation, this analysis of evolving taste is still flawed. It is haunted by what might be termed the force-feeding fallacy. Although the existence of dubstepforum.com, BBC Dubstep Wars, and the Fabric Live Mix helps explain why the circulation of dubstep increased, placing it on people's musical plates, as it were, media and marketing analysis alone does not explain why filth was so readily lapped up. Rather than focusing on the internet merely in terms of circulation, we must instead investigate how a specific cultural logic of the social web contributed to an appetite for dubstep. So if I show you these rather well-known images, can anyone guess what the online behaviour is that debased dubstep became entangled with?
Trolling.
Yeah, you got it. In an Oxford Handbook's entry, my colleague Mike Derrico has persuasively argued that dubstep spread as a sonic meme circa 2010, but what he hasn't quite made explicit is the way that dubstep became thoroughly embroiled with trolling culture. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you these screenshots of a music video in 2012 by Schism, which kind of really showed this entanglement between trolling culture and dubstep. But again, you know, a lot's been written about the very male aspects of trolling culture. There's a monograph by Whitney Phillips in 2017 which really stresses this. And I think that this, again, this analysis is insightful in some way, but I think it also risks the charge of demographic determinism. And this is something that I've been struggling with a lot in my own work recently. I think the trolling connection really works and helps us kind of understand the emergence of the term bro-step around 2010. But what it doesn't explain is why young girls such as Stacey, who I interviewed during my fieldwork, came to become absolutely besotted by dubstep. So, to sum up then, we have rehearsed the problems of technological determinism, situational short-sightedness, the force-feeding fallacy, and demographic determinism, and all are partially fruitful and yet fundamentally flawed. But I want to propose that a broadly psychological perspective offers us a way forward. As Stacey reflected during one of our first discussions, everyone has a backstory. Everyone has shit they've dealt with in their life that, you know, no human being knows how to register or process. I resonate with this music because it's so chaotic and unpredictable and so heavy and deep. I think that's why I love it so much. Because finally, someone put my thought process in a musical setting. If you can put someone's mind process in beats, that's what it's like. So it feels very comforting for me to be in that madness. I only know how to be myself in chaos because I've lived in chaos my whole life. So if I went to a show like Marshmallow, I wouldn't know what to do. You know, that's too happy and too bubbly. I totally have a lot of issues, and I just feel it's an internal purge within myself. I will literally rage until I throw up. And it's kind of like all that bad energy that I have stored so far deep in my soul will just, it executes itself, you know? Stacey's description of her dubstep-fueled, vomit-inducing catharsis is most revealing. We do not just listen to or consume music as a tasty foodstuff. We use it as a drug. Musical taste evolves because we evolve and because we require the use of different musics in different settings and different circumstances in order to self-medicate. That's my rather lame answer to the question at hand. But the more interesting issue concerns unchanging musical appetites. Sometimes we get fixated on one musical flavour because we clearly recognise ourselves or our experiences in its sonic subjectivity. And when we do discover this particular music, our music, as it were, it is easy to become addicted. It feeds us and consumes us simultaneously. As Stacey has put it, dubstep is my heroin.
I'm sure everybody has questions and we could talk for hours, but the first thing I'd like to do is ask all of you if you have any questions for each other before we open it up to the floor.
Thank you, both of you. That was great. I was struck by what Ed said at some point about depth, these deep sounds, and which of course they can be both in the direction of deep, as in otherworldly, and then or very low. And it's incredible how much this connected to the Beethoven late quartets that I was discussing, because for those of you who don't know, that's actually in the Western musical canon what is considered the depth and otherworldly kind of music. So in a way, it feels almost that we could all discuss the question about taste and history, and how did taste evolve in terms of depth, and as you mentioned towards the end of your talk, market, and the sort of almost accusation of superficiality, and this tension between market forces, mercurial market forces, that almost, because of money, are involved, and then there is the other extreme of which is depth and otherworldly, and music that doesn't get entangled, the greatest classics that you mentioned. So I think it's our three talks together, kind of like in a way entangled in this tension between depth and market forces. So I was wondering whether the two of you had any further thoughts on this.
I'm interested in this idea of depth, certainly, but perhaps in a slightly different way. It feels to me as though the way that I record collected and that somehow there was a depth then to my knowledge of what I was building. And what I'm interested in, by throwing a question back, I suppose, is, and it was a question that I planted during the talk, which is, now, and you mentioned about Facebook and algorithms and targeted advertising. Do we think that people's knowledge and taste has the same depth now as it might have done, say, 10, 20 years ago?
This very issue came up at our recent Music and the Internet conference. There's a very, very lively debate between two people. One who said that we are literally being fed stuff by algorithms, and that this is really determining our musical tastes. And then someone used the analogy of us all becoming very boring in our musical tastes because we're constantly fed the same thing, because the algorithm can kind of learn. But again, as I mentioned in my talk, I think we must always be wary of technological determinism. And the other person in this debate was talking about how people use Spotify for world making, and how they use it to kind of, they use their own agency and they create their own playlists, and it's very much an extension of their self. There's a very, very brilliant music scholar based at Exeter, Professor Tia Denora, and following Foucault, her monograph from 2000 was all about the use of music as a technology of the self. And I think that both of you perhaps stressed the kind of passive evolution of musical taste slightly too much. And when we think about the use of music, rather than merely consuming music, then I think things change. And one example of that is my dad had crippling depression a few years ago, just after he retired. And he literally couldn't stomach any music at all, apart from Glenn Gould playing Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier on the piano. And this was a really upsetting time for me, because I hate Bach. I absolutely detest Bach. Why would you listen to Bach when you could listen to Handel? I just don't understand. So I just think that we really do need to focus on the use of music, and maybe even focus on music as a drug rather than as a flavour or a foodstuff or so on.
Yeah, I think it's really just to comment on that. I found it very interesting, the final comments of Stacey there, and my strong belief as well that, that for the reasons that we go to the theatre, for exactly the same reasons, to use it as a drug certainly, and to experience impossible emotions, the impossible emotions that Stacey was talking to you about, at a safe distance. So really, to say that I can see absolutely the connection there.
Well, so there's no need to get the two things in competition, I think, or one to exclude the other. I think, because I completely think that the same question can be asked from the perspective that you very sort of like almost embodied, sort of like knowledge of this of the use and the drug, or a more. I think that you yourself you mentioned how the things shifted from again back to how the deep was interpreted, and depending also to certain. So in a way, I think if there's one takeaway from what I wanted to say is that there's not one agent. Exactly, and so in a way, as much as you want to consider Stacey, I'm sure that you're not considering just her, but actually you're putting her in a network environment, and that's exactly the sort of point that I wanted to make, because I think that sometimes when we talk about taste, we either talk about personal tastes or institutions, which is great chat to have, but I think that is you may miss the big picture in which actually these things are entangled in a way that you just, for example, doing the reception history of a particular composition and how that, I don't know, worked in Croydon, and you're missing out something there. So in a way, I was trying to broaden it up in a more methodological and historical kind of view to make sense of these different agents and how, in reality, you cannot say there is only one of them and know at the same time that none of them is responsible. Everyone has agency, but none of them can control the entire story. Which I think, if you're talking of taste, is quite interesting.
So this idea of network can be really, really helpful. But I think there's one danger with this turn to what's often called actor network theory, or derivatives thereof. Professor Bourne uses the term assemblage theory, which is slightly similar. And I think it's very important that we do focus on these entanglements. I think that's a great word. And I think it's very important that we, look at lots of different things happening simultaneously and so on. But the one danger that Professor Bourne always stresses in terms of this network approach is that we cannot think of it as a flat ontology. We cannot think of all of these things having exactly the same level of agency. And surely some actors or some nodes in this network have more of an influence than others. And I think that's our job as musicologists, not to just say, oh, you and I attended a talk in May or something where there was a paper that was completely within this network paradigm, and yet it was just completely flat. It was like, oh, this person knew this person, and this person knew this person, and it doesn't really help us to see what's going on.
But if I could come up on what you were saying about risk and the opera industry be risk adverse. I love that you mentioned that how many times we are hearing magic flute in this year. So no, I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more about that, because towards the end of your talk you mentioned about almost a responsibility to nurture taste. And at some point I thought that you were mentioning that this is, of course, an opera industry that is relying a lot on museum and the canon just to keep afloat. What would you do? Do you think that there should be a kind of Schlesinger, like the guy that was advertising my Beethoven string quartet, that of course this music was really not something that people wanted to listen, and yet he was trying all sort of stories. What would you do?
I think it is a conundrum that opera companies are struggling with on a daily basis, to find new audiences and to make opera seem relevant and engaging for new audiences. I think as I said, the great problem we face at the moment is the fact that we seem to have got away entirely from the ability to tell a story, and the ability to allow people to experience these very, very difficult emotions. And that is a problem we face. And I think that is why audiences are now far more comfortable going to musical theatre, or for exactly that reason, to have that drug, to have that experience. So now, going to the opera is far more about showing yourself as being part of a cultural elite, showing your status, showing how clever you are, which for me is not the point of opera at all. So, yeah.
Thank you very much all for your comments. So we'd like to open up to the floor now, if you have any questions.
Hi, so I was wondering, you mentioned a lot about like music and psychologically and as a drug, and you spoke a lot about the kind of stage of life thing. I was wondering whether you thought the emergence of like, or maybe the changes in EDM music, for example, like techno and the bass stuff and the dubstep, whether that had, or the use of drugs and actual like drug culture within that has more to do with stage of life, or whether the change in music is coming in because of that drug culture, because it fits in well with that, and how those two kind of paradigms contribute to that.
That's a really great question, thanks. Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is the way that before this kind of net native forms of electronic dance music happened, you know, often it would be 18 plus club nights and so on. And I think that in those circumstances, and there's been a lot of work on these kinds of scenes, I think drugs is definitely a very key point of focus. But then what happens once you start getting these kind of net native genres is it starts being consumed by 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds in their bedrooms. And they are never going to, you know, people start producing the music without ever having experienced it in the live setting and having consumed it in a completely sober way. So that's one thing. The other thing is that in terms of drugs, the thing that I'm really interested in my field work is, rather than the use of mind-altering substances, is the way that hard drugs and the opioid crisis in the Midwest, especially Ohio, creeps in to this dreamland of the Electronic Dance Music Festival. So during my last bit of field work, there were 2 deaths, not because of overdoses of mind-altering substances, but because the opioid crisis somehow managed to creep in to this kind of utopian, completely safe space. So I think that's something that I'm really interested in going forward. The other thing is the use and abuse of prescription meds in the United States. So I think that I'm kind of less interested in the stuff about mind-altering substances and also because a lot of this work has been done really well by some of my colleagues. But I'm very interested in this kind of really chilling connection between hard drugs and also prescription drugs and these newer net native genres.
Can I ask as well, Ed, about just going on about the stage of life? I think the demographic for your music is what? I mean, what is the...
I think there's 2 demographics. There's they're often known as scrubs online, and these are these kind of 12, 13-year-old, or even pre-pubescent consumers. But then on the other hand, you have this more traditional countercultural live scene, but it's these huge corporate festivals rather than rather than monthly club nights, which is what we're used to more in UK dance culture. Also, with Stage of Life, I found it very interesting that you said that you started kind of collecting when you were relatively young, and I think the other thing that we haven't really touched upon is that there's been, well, in fact you did touch upon it, that paper about the fact that our musical tastes can become quite powerfully configured when we're in early adolescence, and there's been several studies about that. So,
I'm afraid I am a complete non-academic with this, so these are just knee-jerk reactions, but it feels to me that, again, going back to my talk, it is so much about identity building at that stage. You know, building your character, what your character is going to be, you know, and so I was interested to find out about, you know, but interesting that it should be prepubescent and, you know, into puberty itself. But at that stage where people are desperately trying to work out exactly who they are.
So I wanted to ask about this theme of the museumization of opera and more generally classical music. I mean, I don't know if you remember the essay that Milton Babbitt wrote, Who Cares If You Listen? Where he says, I don't care. You know, and this is a theme that is common in 20th century music, is the introspectiveness. Is, you know, it used to be in the 19th century, it's very nationalistic. You know, it was in many ways quite populist, going off of Beethoven's theme of liberating music from patronage, right, becoming sort of populist music, right? And so in the 20th century, it just, you know, the sense I get is, you know, music kind of turned into a personal endeavor, right? Especially classical music, you know, sort of the Schoenberg-like kind of way of doing things. So I wonder what you think about the effect of that kind of introspectiveness, whether you agree with it, and also what you think the effect is on the popularity of classical music, whether it's turned off audiences and sort of opened up avenues toward other kinds of music.
Okay, fine. Yeah, well, you said this really well. So this is the way most people tell the story, in a way that the path of many composers, especially towards the 20th century, have in a way narrowed down a music that is ever more not intimate, but for a very elite. So what I was discussing with the Beethoven's Late Quartet, a music that you need to some knowledge to decode. You cannot just listen and enjoy it, but you actually need to understand the counterpoint, otherwise you're not making sense of what's happening. And what you said is, you know, Schoenberg is the perfect sort of like end of the story in that sense. Now, what people, the way people react to this is say like, oh, we then need to liberate music again from elites and, you know, make it, but once again, I think that this story has been rehearsed and rehearsed a number of times, and depending on who's telling the story, is also using it to, you know, in a specific way and according to specific agenda. I'm not a 20th century specialist, but in terms of as an historian, I can tell you that even in the 19th century, that you say that actually music was much more national, you find that the users of music, just to go back to what Ed say, they reveal that people in reality do all sorts of things with music, and the thickness of this use actually helps you understand a score that perhaps at the first glance it seems quite elite in a all sort of way. Because to me, what Schlesinger, this publisher, was doing with Beethoven's Three Quartet was a super popular thing. So can you see that what I'm saying, that actually what music that, you know, is the elite of the elitist can actually be sold in a very popular way. And, you know, and there are probably counter examples to deal with this. But yes, you know, that's a very popular way of saying that, you know, sometimes classical music today is not listened to enough because of this restriction and this elitism. So very
I'd just like to totally disagree with the last point. So for many hundreds of years, classical music was a stately thing. Most composers would perform chambers to the aristocracy. In the 20th century, maybe you had for the first time composers who wrote for the people like Shostakovich, who wrote for people struggling in wartime. You had people like Britten who spoke about the fact that he could never write music if he didn't know that people would listen to it, and he wrote for the audience itself. And I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of what you were saying, Paul, about how opera houses are just recycling the same things, because you mentioned Janacek, you mentioned Mozart, you mentioned Verdi, but the Royal Opera House, for instance, at the moment, are also doing Billy Budd by Britain. They're also doing, last year they did Jodie Talbot premiere, and people enjoy that, and they have whole student performances. You've got Boris Godunov and Faust, and there are whole student performances now where every ticket is exclusive for students to start with, and they're £125, right? And when I went to see the Nose last year, Mishi Shostakovich and some modern opera, it was sold out for students. And Wigmore Hall, Royal Festival Hall, the Barbican, I'm advertising here on all the students in the house, the Royal Opera House and the EMO, they all do student schemes now. You can get ridiculously cheap tickets, and every time they sell out. I think it's marvellous that I've seen a resurgence, at least in the last 10 years, of classical music being something which is more accessible to younger people, more accessible to the working class, maybe because of the fact that we now have Spotify and you can stream classical music with a playlist maybe while you're revising, then maybe you fall in love with something. And it's no surprise then to me that actually last year, by percentage growth, classical music grew the most out of any genre. And I think there are some pieces which will always be performed, maybe because they ascend out of whether they are just from the time or not, whether they are popular, right? The Magic Flute is something, Bohemian maybe will live forever. Maybe this is something that some pieces of music, the ring cycle, they transcend such passion. But I don't know if you agree with me. Maybe I'm totally short-sighted.
I agree with you. No, I mentioned as well that I feel that opera companies are working harder than ever to find new audiences. That is absolutely true. But I have and of course, Traviatas and Bohèmes must come round and round and round. But in my time at the Royal Opera House, the same old production of Traviata coming back season after season after season, for the only reason, because it will pack a house out.
Yeah.
And not even always for real artistic endeavour either. Sometimes the production values are really quite shoddy. But because it was Traviata, they knew that they would get the money in. You know, it swings and roundabouts, because that money can then be used for the sort of schemes you're talking about. You know.
Do you think we should be so pessimistic? Do you think we should actually, there are things to celebrate?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I tell you where my feeling is that the place to celebrate things are outside of the opera houses. It's in art galleries, abandoned art galleries in Peckham and multi-storey car parks and all the unusual venues that opera and classical music is now breaking out into. So that we're breaking out of those traditional confines and all of the baggage, the social baggage that goes with it. Now, I'm absolutely fascinated by the ideas that Fabio was talking about of the 18th century opera house, of watching and looking at one another. And I feel that Wagner actually and his cinematic experience have a lot to answer for. You know, that actually we would do well to go back to a stage where we were engaged in an activity, in an art form where thousands of connections were being made, not only with the stage itself, but with everyone around it, and it becomes a huge web. You know. And I think we're you know, those sorts of things are starting to happen again. But it's very unlikely that they'll happen with a proscenium arch in the room.
And I think we've got time for just one more quick question.
Can you like to comment on two areas that helped music evolve? One is on technology. I know you talked about technological determinism, but surely the development of tools that people can use, particularly composers, has developed. So if you think something like Pro Tools, which is a software-based tool, which replaces what in the past would have cost thousands of dollars for hardware synthesizer or whatever. So surely technology does at least increase the opportunities for development. And also on, going back to what you said about opera and risk averse, you mentioned written on skin. I noticed that there's a lot more, it seems to me, there's a lot more, not just opera, but classical, modern classical music, new ideas and happening in America than in England. And that's possibly because there's a lot more philanthropy. But also it seems to me even the public sector is quite active. So I know a couple of examples. What was it? John Adams, Nixon in America, or a guy wrote an opera last year about Steve Jobs. I can't see this happening in England. So it's two issues. One is the technology which allows things to happen, and two, is there a sort of conservatism in the establishment of commissioning in opera and modern classical music in the UK?
Yeah, I think technology, and you talked about reducing cost of software. I think that's definitely true, but I think it's a question of there's always people behind that technology, and the thing that I was kind of working against with these quite kind of radical ideas in this kind of obsession with materiality and the humanities at the moment, saying that this object has an agency of its own, and I think that it actually has a set of affordances, and it kind of provides opportunities rather than determining an outcome. So it's more of a kind of moot point.
Well, 1 minute, oh goodness, right, okay. Well, I think actually you hit the nail on the head with American philanthropy. I think that is crucial, in fact, to ensuring life in the art form, and allows for a freedom which we simply don't have here. And it's interesting, I think, historically as well, as an island state, as separate from Europe, separate now more than ever, just to get topical for a moment, we have always been conservative, in our musical tastes. And I think that is something that has certainly carried through to the 21st century. But ultimately, it comes down to money. and America has more of it.
On the pessimistic note of money and Brexit, we'll conclude for today. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you again to all our speakers for this.